You know his words will get you farther than the film will ever go. Give him a moment of your time, he'll tell you what's wrong with the show. He knows what's good, what's bad, what's really bad. His face is just a sign. Say hello to Confused Matthew.
The last time I talked about Deep Space Nine, I made the comment that the 7th and final season was worse than every season of Star Trek Voyager combined. Believe me, that is no small criticism. In retrospect, if I'm being honest, it probably wasn't. At the very most, it was probably just as bad as all the seasons of Star Trek Voyager combined. The reason I said something so hasty is because I would expect shit like this from Voyager. I watched Deep Space Nine to get away from shit like this. Now, just to recap how I felt about the series as a whole, I thought Deep Space Nine was about as far away from Star Trek as you can possibly get, but was nevertheless a great science fiction serial. But this season didn't even have that going for it. It was just piss awful. As I mentioned in the trailer, parts of this review will also feature commentary by my brother. Deep Space Nine was one of those shows that we both experienced together, and Season 7 was something we endured together. Our comments about what made this season awful have been there from the beginning, are complementary to one another, and though he had a few different views than I did, especially regarding the character Ezri, it just didn't seem right to try to do this without him. But before we delve into the swamp of the 7th season, we need to first go through the last season's finale entitled Tears of the Prophets. While this technically won't constitute a Season 7 review, it's necessary because this was the seed that grew the shit tree of that season. The episode opens with Captain Sisko receiving a medal for outstanding leadership and bravery during the war. I want to repeat that. The episode opens with Captain Sisko receiving a medal for outstanding leadership and bravery during the war. With the ceremony ended, Admiral Ross then informs him that Starfleet has decided to launch an offensive strike against a system in Cardassian territory. After this, we cut to Dax and Worf. I hate Worf. Discussing their new plans to have a baby with Bashir and Quark. That is, they're discussing the plans with Bashir and Quark. They're not planning on having babies with them. That would just be messed up. Almost as messed up as Chitara over there trying to squeeze a rigid Wolfman baby out of her. This makes Bashir and Quark jealous and depressed, so they go to... No, not gonna talk about that right now. Talk about that later. Meanwhile, Damar and Weyoun are discussing the vulnerability of the Chintaka system when suddenly Gul Dukat enters the room. Upon seeing this for the first time, my brother and I had exactly the same reaction. Run, Damar. Run. You see, Damar murdered Gul Dukat's daughter earlier in the season, who was probably the only thing in the universe Dukat ever cared about for genuine and unselfish reasons. And here we get to the first of many instances, both in this episode and the next season, of the writing being reduced to the Voyager level of stupid. And I mean the Herosian expanding the holodecks to encompass most of Voyager even though space has never been an issue on the holodecks stupid. Dukat says, "Oh, don't worry, Damar. I don't hold you responsible for Ziel's death. Even though you were. You may have fired the phaser, and thus were responsible for her death, but it was Benjamin Sisko who forced your hand." Let's just think about the logic of what was just said there for a minute. The reason Damar killed Ziel is because he overheard a conversation between she and Dukat where she confessed that she helped the Resistance sabotage the station, that she chose to side with the opposition rather than her own people. Well, that's all Damar needed to hear. Without any warning, he immediately pulled out a phaser and executed her on the spot. Without even understanding why Dukat was upset about this, he then uttered his final words to him, "You heard her, she's a traitor." Sisko didn't make Damar a nationalist. Sisko didn't put Damar in the same room with Dukat and Ziel when she gave her confession. Sisko didn't put the phaser in his hand. Sisko didn't squeeze the trigger for him. Sisko had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of Ziel. Not even in the slightest fathomable degree. But even though the relationship between Sisko and Dukat had developed into something much more dynamic than this, the writers are now forcing them to revert back to nothing more than rivals. And to rekindle that rivalry, they've got to make Dukat come to dirt stupid conclusions. So sure, Sisko killed Ziyal. So did Joyce DeWitt. So now Dukat is going to take his revenge on Sisko, cause they're rivals, remember? And to do that, he says he needs a Bajoran artifact. When asked what it will do, Dukat tells them it will allow Dominion reinforcements to come through the wormhole and destroy Captain Sisko and the Federation once and for all. And by that, of course, he means it will do the exact opposite of everything he just said. But they aren't making this up as they go along or anything, no. So back on the station, Sisko returns to his quarters when he suddenly gets a vision from the Prophets. They tell him that it's too dangerous for him to go along for the mission and that they want him to stay behind. Sisko then reports this to Admiral Ross, and the Admiral asks if he's asking for permission to remain behind. Sisko replies, "It's not about what I want, it's about what the Prophets want." The Admiral tells him that that's not a good enough answer, not for a Starfleet captain. When Sisko explains that the Prophets don't see him as a Starfleet captain, but as the emissary, the Admiral then tirades into a lecture. He says, "That's the problem, isn't it? For the last 6 years, you've tried to be both. And up until now, I've been patient. I've indulged you, I've gone out on a limb for you many times, but this is it. You've got to make a decision. You are either the emissary or a Starfleet captain. You can't be both." Well, considering you just gave him a medal for outstanding conduct as a Starfleet captain, obviously it hasn't been a problem, even if he has tried to be both. Add to that the fact that the few times he's tried to be both have produced good results, from discovering Valhalla, to saving the Bajorans from destruction from the Dominion, to preventing the enemy reinforcements from coming through the wormhole and crushing the Federation. And especially considering the Prophets are the only thing standing between the Alpha Quadrant and total annihilation, you'd think they'd be inclined to listen to the Prophets like they always have. So why is Admiral Ross suddenly being such a dick about this? Can you guess what word I'm thinking of? Meanwhile on Cardassia, Dukat has found his magic artifact. He sets a case down on the table and opens it, revealing a doll of the Bajoran Santa Claus. Dukat then picks up the doll and begins chanting incantations. Incantations. Like he's D&D spellcasting or something. Alakazam, Alakazoo, Hocus Pocus. Now, I was hoping they were bringing back the crazy Dukat here. That he'd spout his magic spells, nothing would happen, and they'd do something from there. Guess what actually happens? He breaks the doll, and out flies a magic fire monster that demonically possesses Gul Dukat. This is where the worse than Voyager remark comes into play. I have never seen anything on Star Trek Voyager that was more ridiculous than this. Satan Dukat tells Damar and Weyoun that he has a special place for them in the bowels of hell, to which they respond by throwing holy water on him and shouting, "The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!" Come on, you're better than this. Welcome to part 2. So the Defiant is ready to leave with the Armada to strike the Chintaka system. Sisko decides to go along rather than stay behind, but even though she's a member of the Defiant crew and everyone else is going, Dax is staying behind. She goes down to one of the Bajoran orbs and thanks the Prophets for helping her and Worf to have a lycanthropic freak baby, when all of a sudden Dukat beams onto the station and kills Jadzia with magic. The issue of Jadzia is something that my brother and I heavily disagree on. In my personal opinion, well, I just never liked Jadzia. She was boring, obvious, unconvincing, and obnoxious in her unconvincingness. I don't buy you. Ezri was a huge improvement, and the death of Jadzia was no loss to me. Nevertheless, she was a main character that has been there from the beginning, and she deserves at least that much respect. And this is how she dies. Killed by a magic fire monster. After this nonsense, Dukat opens the orb box and releases the magic fire monster into the orb, causing it to go dark, as well as sealing the wormhole. He then apologizes for magically killing Jadzia and beams out into God knows what. So, what was Cisco supposed to have done about this if he stayed behind? Cisco doesn't have any magic powers. What, was he going to jump into a flame-retardant suit and run all the way down there to stop Fire Marshal Dukat? He wouldn't have had the time or the means. Come on, you're better than this. So the battle goes well, but the crew gets the news of what happened to the wormhole, the orbs, and to Jadzia. Meanwhile, Dukat contacts Damar and Wayun regarding what happened. Wayun is naturally furious as the wormhole is now closed for good and there is no chance of getting reinforcements through. Dukat then proceeds to explain why they should feel good about this. And here, once again, is where the dialogue takes a nosedive into the Voyager level of stupid. And I mean the future man saying he has no time when he's sitting in a time machine stupid, where the writers attempt to establish things that just don't make any goddamn sense. Dukat tells them the Bajorans have been cut off from their gods. No, they haven't. If anyone actually believes in a god or gods, then it's impossible for anyone to cut them off from their gods. God isn't just out there, it's in here. Oh, this is all audio. I'm pointing to my chest at this point. If the Bajorans have faith that the prophets are their one true gods, then nothing secular or material, such as the wormhole being closed, should be able to sway them from that. And what's more, the wormhole being open at all is recent. Only about 5 years old. The wormhole was closed every day before this, and the Bajorans couldn't have cared less because their belief in the prophets as gods is an article of faith. In fact, the Federation had tinkered with the idea of closing the wormhole many times throughout the series, and though this was cause for a bit of concern on the part of the Bajorans, not one of them ever said, "No, you'll cut us off from our gods and we'll lose our piety." So the only thing left to try to make sense out of this statement is that the orbs aren't working anymore. So what, the Bajorans lose their hardline to the prophets, so now they're just not going to believe anymore? What the hell kind of Bajorans are these? Pious religious believers my ass. Unless the Bajorans have all become materialists all of a sudden, neither the wormhole being closed nor the orbs not working anymore should make a damn bit of difference to them. This whole thing is just stupid. And what's worse is that it's only half over. After all the bullshit about the Bajorans being cut off from their gods, Damar asks what the audience is thinking. How does that help us? To which Dukat responds, because Captain Cisco has been cut off from the prophets as well, and without the prophets, he's just another Starfleet captain. Wayun says, and this is supposed to make me feel better? And Dukat answers, oh, believe me, it will. How? The prophets have absolutely nothing to do with how Cisco manages himself in the war. It's not like every time he goes out for battle he consults with the prophets first. Just another Starfleet captain is all Cisco has ever been when it comes to fighting the war. So how is that any different now? How is Cisco being cut off from the prophets, whom he's had limited contact with in the show's run anyway, going to change a damn thing when it comes to the war? Logically, it shouldn't, but we'll see what they manage to pull out of their asses in the 7th season. So the Defiant returns to the station, and the crew come aboard to find the Bajoran community murmuring to themselves in a state of panic. Not like believers who have had their faith shaken, but more like heroin addicts who have had their supply cut off. It's the kind of mischaracterized pseudo-religious bullshit that would give Richard Dawkins a wet dream, and something we got a lot of in the next season. Of course, a kid runs up to Cisco and begs for him to give her fix. Emissary, Mommy says the orbs are dark, that the prophets have abandoned us. They haven't abandoned you, they've been attacked. That's like trying to argue that if a supply line is attacked, the suppliers have abandoned you. And even if we want to try to argue that the Bajorans don't know the prophets have been attacked, then the next logical step is just to not know what the hell is going on, not to assume they've abandoned them. Why do they think they've abandoned them? Oh, yes. Oh, and it had to be a kid, you understand. Having an adult talking to Cisco about this just wouldn't have been pathetic enough. So Worf and Cisco come to Jadzia's deathbed. Now, even if you're like me and you were never a fan of Jadzia, this scene still manages to disappoint because not only does Jadzia have nothing interesting to say as her last words, but she gives all the dialogue to the one character she never had any chemistry with, and none to the character that she did. Finally, Jadzia dies, and Klingon tradition dictates that Worf has to have an orgasm in honor of this. Later on, Sisko, who should have had the final words with Jadzia, gets to talk to her casket. Wonderful. He says to her, something has happened to the prophets, something that's caused them to turn their backs on Bajor, even though they haven't, and I'm responsible, even though he isn't. I've failed as the emissary. Well, if we manage to swallow the tripe that's been fed to us in this episode, then sure, and for the first time in my life, I've failed in my duty as a Starfleet officer. Now, how the hell did you do that? The whole reason you're blaming yourself for this is because you succeeded in your duty as a Starfleet officer. Come on, you're better than this. So Sisko decides that now of all times is the best time to take a vacation. He travels to Earth to work with his father at his restaurant. Oh, and he takes Jake with him too, because Jake's not doing anything with his life right now, like trying to be a reporter or anything. Please stay tuned, because this gets much worse. Welcome to part 3, and here we begin the actual review of Season 7. Now, as the description says, this is a season's review, so I'm not going to go episode by episode here. Season 7 did have a few good episodes, but this review will be concerned with the season overall. So from the season's premiere on, we are introduced to a host of plot and character threads, and none of them work. We begin with Sisko, who's moping around in his father's restaurant with Jake. As we saw in the last parts, this is for absolutely no reason, which will make the scenario both boring and tedious to sit through. Sisko's woes are in effect with no cause. So while this is going on, we learn back on Deep Space Nine that Kira has been promoted to colonel and temporarily put in charge of the station. As she stands on the promenade talking to Odo, we are introduced to one of the first and worst plot threads of the season. It turns out that after the Prophets got attacked and the orbs went dark, many of the Bajorans went and joined the cult of the Pa-Wraiths. What is the cult of the Pa-Wraiths? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's pretty much exactly like the Bajorans worshipping the Prophets, except now they're worshipping the magic fire monsters that live in the caves. Remember, the reason they're doing this is because the wormhole is closed and the Prophets aren't able to talk to them anymore. Now, the wormhole was discovered 5 years ago. Before its discovery, the Bajorans got along worshipping the Prophets just fine. Also, during the occupation, many of the orbs were taken by the Cardassians, and even without them, the Bajorans got along worshipping the Prophets just fine. The point is that not only is there no reason for the Bajorans to be doing this, but this whole storyline with the cult of the Pa-Wraiths is just asinine. If the Vatican were closed down for an indefinite amount of time, I can't imagine a single Catholic the world over even renouncing their religion, let alone leaping to the opposite extreme, which leads me to my second problem. Religions don't have opposites, they have alternatives. Now, some of you may say, well, what about Satanism? I'm glad you asked, hypothetical viewer. Satanism doesn't exist. It's a crock. It's an urban legend, it's for the kids. There is a Satanism of sorts, but this was created in 1966 by Anton LaVey, who named his philosophy Satanism solely to be contrary to Orthodox Christianity. If you read the Satanic Bible, you'll discover that LaVey's new Satanism is just old libertarianism in a shiny new wrapper. The closest thing to the opposite of a Christian is an atheist, and that's exhaustive. The closest thing to the opposite of any religion is an atheist. What the Bajorans are doing here makes about as much sense as if Worf were to say, well, the sword of Kahless is gone, obviously Kahless has abandoned me, I guess I'll go worship Feklar, brah, 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 brah. Religions do not work that way. But now the writers are going to force us to endure stupid and poorly motivated nonsense just to create more us versus them crap. Federation versus Dominion, Emissary versus Anti-Emissary, and now, Prophet versus Pa-Wraith. Yuck.
So we cut to Sisko, who's still moping around the restaurant. How this is supposed to help him figure things out is still a mystery to me. He isn't even doing any soul searching, he's just sulking. And that's another problem with this Sisko thread. There is no clear strategy on his part for having come here in the first place in order to work things out for himself. So eventually Sisko is contacted through a series of visions by a female prophet. But unlike his other prophet visions, she isn't in the form of a familiar person. She seems to have an identity all her own. Now, this becomes a major and ridiculous plot thread later on, but there are already two serious problems with it. First, if it was always possible for the prophets to give people visions without the use of orbs or being in the wormhole, why have the orbs at all? The answer is because this is fucking bullshit, and it doesn't make any sense based on everything we know about how, when, and where the prophets communicate. Second, why was it necessary for Sisko to go home in order for this to happen? If this prophet lady can just talk to him in his mind, couldn't she have done that while he was on the station?
Anyway, for the meantime, Sisko has no idea who this woman is, or even that she's a female prophet. As far as he knows, she was just a face in the sand. He tries to reconstruct the face on a pad when Jake sees it and notes that he recognizes her from an old photo he found laying around. They both look at the photo, and Sisko confirms that it's her when his dad comes in and freaks out over the picture. When asked who the woman is, his dad replies, "No one at all. You hear? She's no one at all." Okay, well, I guess that settles it then. Wait, Dad, shouldn't we ask more questions about this? No, it's okay, Jake, we figured it out. She's no one. I mean, honestly, what made him think that was gonna work? Eventually, of course, Sisko is so annoying that his father finally decides to tell him what was really going on. He explains the woman in the photo is Sisko's real mother. She married him, had a kid with him, and then left and later died in a shuttle accident. And from this point on, any defense against the claim that DS9 was a soap opera in space is just futile. Still, I can't believe they managed to sink this low. She wasn't your real mother, this woman was! Dun dun dun! So Sisko now decides that he has to go to some moon and track this woman down.
So before they all get ready to leave, Sisko's outside taking out the trash or something when a creepy little Bajoran kid shows up. He greets him, and after a little bit of subterfuge and innuendo, mentions the orb that Sisko's apparently looking for. This makes Sisko very surprised, and he turns around and stares right at him. And this is when our veteran space captain, who's fought legions of Jem'Hadar and stood up to an entire empire, gets stabbed in the belly by a little kid and left to bleed on the sidewalk. And as if this weren't ridiculous enough, Sarek Lofton then hits the kid over the head with a bag of flour and flails over to his father to help him. And he does all this without bothering to restrain or disarm the unconscious assassin. After this relatively pointless and unthreatening encounter, Sisko, Jake, and Grandpa are all getting ready to leave when they hear a knock at the door. Grandpa answers, revealing a little teenage girl who's apparently gotten lost on the way to the High School Musical set. Before they can direct her back to her high school, the little girl says, "Hello, Benjamin." Oh no. No. They didn't replace Jadzia. Grown up, strong, brash, confident Jadzia. Of course they did. This is the new Dax. Apparently, this little girl was serving on the starship that was carrying the Dax symbiote when the ship was attacked, and because of injury, the symbiote had to be immediately joined, and since this was the only Trill on board, it had to be her. Now, this wasn't an uninteresting premise for the new Dax, but why in the fuck did they cast a little girl who looks and sounds like she just came off of the Mickey Mouse Club? Now, just to give my take on Jadzia, well, I kinda like the idea that they had for her. I just didn't think that Terry Farrell was up to the task of pulling it off. So when her character died, I was really looking forward to them casting an actor who could, but instead, they abandoned the character's lifetimes of experience angle altogether and reduced this person to a confused mess. This completely kills the only interesting element of this character, the Dax symbiote. So instead, we're forced to try and find Ezri interesting. And she isn't. At all. She's nothing more than an annoying, whining emo girl. I'm space sick. Oh, I don't like Ractagino, but why am I drinking it? I'm tortured. Shut the hell up. Jadzia being G.I. Jane, however convincing or unconvincing, was a million times more interesting and less irritating than listening to this little chipmunk whine about being confused. So, after a little bit of conversation, Jake, Cisco, Grandpa, and Princess Pretty all decide to go to Tyree together.
They dig around on the surface for a little bit until Cisco finds what he's looking for, an orb box buried in the sand. He's just about to open it when he suddenly appears in a mental institution and a guy enters the room trying to convince him that his name is Benny Russell and that everything he believes about the station is a delusion. Okay, first of all, why would they reuse an idea from one of the worst episodes ever made in the history of Star Trek or anything else on television? Second of all, what's with all the magic people being able to invade Cisco's mind all of a sudden, whenever they want, wherever he is, and wherever they are? And if they can just do that, why haven't they done it before now? Where have the Pirates been all this time? Hell, where are they now? And what's more, if they can give him a vision in a way that makes him have no awareness of reality, why would they care what that vision is? Why not just seal him up in his own mind and let him be comatose for the rest of his life? The answer to this, and all other questions like this, is a wizard and Santa Claus did it. Eventually, Cisco breaks the stupid vision and opens the damn box. This causes the wormhole to reopen. Boy, I'll bet all those stupid Bajorans are going to be red in the face. And Cisco talks to the woman, who now reveals that she is his mom. She took over the body of Sarah Cisco years ago and made sure she would marry Cisco's dad so she would give birth to him. Which means that everything Cisco's done up until this point was just predetermined. So why do they bother making us care about it? Also, the suggestion that Cisco is half prophet is about as unnecessary and contrived as the sudden reveal that Bashir was genetically engineered. It's introduced so late that it can't possibly add anything to either character, and since both characters were interesting before it was tacked on, we can't really help but feel that it's, well, tacked on. Here's another problem I have with this being tossed into the plot, and it's similar to something Stan said. If the prophets can just take over people's bodies, what do they need orbs for? They can just inhabit someone and deal out instructions there. It's also hard to understand why the prophets didn't just inhabit Cisco to fight Dukat when he made the orbs go dark, since they obviously knew he was going to do this. So now some may argue that they didn't want to interfere with his free will, which would make sense if they hadn't already prearranged his whole existence. Long story short, this tacked-on plot thread does nothing to add to the character, actually takes away from it in many respects, and only raises more questions than it answers. And as we will see, that can easily be said for the rest of the season. Welcome to part 4. So now that Cisco's prophet mom has been released from her orb, the orbs and the wormhole are back. Now, if you remember, their absence was the only motivation given for why some Bajorans went and joined the cult of the magic fire monsters. So I guess that means they can go back to worshipping the prophets now, right? Right? Anyway, back on the station, Worf is still depressed about Jadzia's death. Why is he still depressed about this? Well, as O'Brien eventually explains, she's not in Sto-vo-kor. Yeah, she's not a Klingon. Well, as far as Worf was concerned, she was. She did join the House of Martok. Yeah, but she's not a Klingon. So to make himself feel better about this nonsense, Worf then goes into, fuck balls! Now we get to another one of the massive problems of this season. Vic Fontaine. Oh, the hate. While this story arc was technically introduced in the 6th season, it didn't completely take over the scenery until season 7. Now, Star Trek has made some very good holographic characters in its time, from Moriarty in The Next Generation to the Doctor on Voyager, who was one of the few characters on that show that I actually liked. That is, I did like him until the later seasons, where for some reason they turned him into a cross between another Neelix and an annoying waiter. Hello, how can I help you today? Perhaps you'd like to try some vinaigrette salad dressing. I'm a hologram. Oh, everything's so wonderful. But no holographic character, good or bad, has ever been more loathsome than this piece of shit. Now, before I get into the awfulness of this character, let me comment on another side effect he was responsible for. From this point on in the series, whenever the crew get together or a discussion takes place between two characters, they now make their official meeting place Vix. The official watering hole, epicenter, and community gathering place of Deep Space Nine is, and always has been, Quarks! It's not like we needed a community center, we've had one from day one, and it was a good one too. Just keep it in Quarks. What the hell do we need this for? Quarks was colorful, vibrant, and interesting, with intriguing looking aliens hanging out and colorful Dabo wheels spinning around every day. But when you go into Vix, you're looking at a lot of blank walls and a bunch of empty seats. This is boring. I mean, did they just lose their budget for extras or something? So not only have they given us a second community hub that we didn't even fucking need, but it's almost like they went out of their way to make it 10 times less interesting than the first one. Whenever these people are in Vix, I only ever want them to be someplace else. So with that point made, let's talk about the actual character. The reason I hate Vic Fontaine as much as I do is because his character is essentially a walking B story. Now, B stories have one and only one function: to fill the time gaps of the A story. When you've got an A story that you're working hard on but that doesn't last the episode's full time, you create a B story to make up the time. These B stories are usually off the point, but also fun and lighthearted. A good example of them are Deanna trying to get her rank, or O'Brien and Nog navigating the Great River. But when the writers of Season 7 had absolutely no idea how to fill the time gaps of an episode, instead of putting forth some effort and writing a B story, they would bring in Vic Fontaine to sing a Sinatra song. Full songs! Now, I would assume that anyone who watches Deep Space Nine does so because they like science fiction, and if you don't like science fiction, you're probably not going to watch this show. Not everyone likes Sinatra. I don't like Sinatra, and I'm really curious as to why the writers thought it was okay to subject people to this every other week. I'll tell you, if this were my show, I could have come up with something 100 times better than Vix. Hey Quark, I'm a little down right now. You want to go to Zepp's? Sure! But this only works for me because I'm a Led Zeppelin fan. If you don't like Zepp, you're probably going to be pretty alienated. Season 7 premiered in 1998, which was well before TiVos were prevalent, so when these scenes came on, I couldn't do anything about it but just mute the damn thing and hope it was over quickly. Why should I have to do that? They could have just as easily replaced Vic Fontaine's character with a huge intermission sign. Whenever his character came on, I just wanted to hold up a crucifix to try to ward him off. So over on the other side of this lousy season, a lot of the Bajorans are still in the cult of the magic fire monsters, even though the conflicts that drove them to it have all been resolved. The season never does any work to give us a reason why they continue to be involved in this cult, so here's my guess. A magic fire monster did it. Of course, the real reason is that this storyline is supposed to be the launching pad for Gul Dukat's retarded new story arc. Gul Dukat's character had always had a natural flow in the series. Yes, he was supposed to be the bad guy, but there was always a down-to-earth sensibility about his decisions. Every decision he made seemed spontaneous and pragmatic given the current circumstances. That ends here. Like the Bajorans' religion, the writers decided in this season to abandon this character's spontaneity and wrench him into whatever role would be sufficiently anti enough. And in this case, that means making him the anti-emissary. This starts with him becoming a cult leader in one episode, but eventually travels into the realm of the absolutely ridiculous. At the beginning of the setup episode, Dukat strolls casually onto the station after being surgically altered to look like a Bajoran. I will always have fond memories of my brother and I absolutely cracking up over the notion that this would actually fool anyone. He still looks exactly like Gul Dukat. And it's not as if Gul Dukat isn't well known around these parts. It's like, imagine if 5 years after the Holocaust, Hitler strolled onto a Jewish settlement wearing Groucho Marx glasses. It's that bad. If he was going to go to the trouble of being surgically altered, why didn't he have them make him look like a completely different person? Of course, as with everything in this crappy season, this is the beginning of Gul Dukat's plan to do stuff for reasons. He eventually introduces himself to Kai Wynn and tries to convince her that he has been sent by the Prophets. After gaining her trust by this charade, he eventually reveals what's really going on, that he has actually been sent by the magic fire monsters. In one of the only displays of in-character reactions the season has, Kai Wynn reacts exactly the way you would expect her to. She slaps him in the face, calls him a heretic, and runs away crying. This is very important because never, not under any circumstances, ever would Kai Wynn turn her back on the Prophets. In my personal opinion, Kai Wynn was one of the most interesting characters on the show because she wasn't exactly evil, she was just ambitious. Her ambitions caused her to do a lot of devious things in the series, but regardless, she really did care about Bajor and the future of her people. But one character trait she had was always made crystal clear to us. Kai Wynn was a person of faith. In fact, her faith was the one thing she never let her ambitions get the better of. Kai Wynn genuinely did not like Captain Sisko. Not only did he represent a threat to her political position, but he was also an outsider and, in her mind, a false emissary. However, when Sisko found Bahala, the first thing Kai Wynn did was come to him and say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. Only the emissary could have found Bahala." And she worked with him and trusted him from that point on. She still didn't like him, but she bent to the Prophet's will because her faith was that strong. And that's not the only example. At one point in the series, Wynn tells Kira a very personal story of when she was held prisoner and beaten by the Cardassians, and she punctuates this with, "While you were in the Resistance and had your weapons to protect you, all I had was my faith." I repeat, under no circumstances ever would Wynn turn her back on the Prophets. It's not in her character. So how are they going to get her to flip-flop on all this established piety? Well, after learning that Gul Dukat was sent by the Pa-Wraiths, she goes to Kira with a heartfelt plead for guidance. She tells her that she wants to be rid of evilness and ambition, and that she will do whatever she needs to do to repent and change. Now keep in mind that this isn't a lie or trick on her part. She really came down here with a genuine intention to reform her ways. After this scene, she comes back to Dukat, and we get this. So what happened? Well, I went to Kira, and I was genuinely sorry for the things I've done, and I really was going to do whatever it takes to repent, but Kira told me I couldn't be Kai anymore. But I still want to be Kai, so now I am going to join the cult of the Pa-Wraiths. And thus not be Kai anymore! Come on, you're better than this! I never thought I would live to see the day when Deep Space Nine, of all shows, had the problem of not being able to give anyone a good motivation for behaving the way they do. They haven't done it once so far. And the motivations they do give aren't just poor, they're awful, ridiculous, profoundly stupid, and they just don't make any goddamn sense. And as we will see, that could easily be said for the rest of the season. Welcome to part 5. So now that we've taken two spontaneous characters and reduced them to a shallow duo of bad guys, they're off to go do bad guy things. This might not have been so much of a problem if we didn't have to watch it, but ultimately, this story arc of Kai Wynn and Ducat fills another Vic Fontaine role of padding the hell out of this season. 90% of their scenes are spent in tiresome exposition about what they're doing, which is made worse by the fact that what they're doing is trying to decode a magic book. This could not be more out of place if Atreyu suddenly rode into Darkur province on Artax. Oh, and we also get the obligatory old guy popping up every 5 minutes to say, "Don't open the book." Gee, I wonder what's going to happen to this guy. So to get back to a story arc that we actually care about, hey, look, it's the Dominion! Yeah, the Dominion is awesome. They couldn't possibly screw them up this season, right? Well, right. The Dominion doesn't get screwed up per se, it just gets bogged down by a completely unnecessary addition to its ranks. I am talking, of course, about the Breen. The Breen had been shown infrequently throughout the canons of Star Trek. When we do see them, we don't really learn anything about their goals or their culture, and even the way they look and sound is shrouded in mystery. At first, I thought this was just to add a mystique to their presence, and while I still think that's true to a point, Season 7 leads me to believe that there was something else going on here. The Breen seem to be pretty badass from a distance, but when you're subjected to them on an episode-to-episode basis, you really start to realize just how silly they actually are, especially in this season. I don't know exactly whose idea it was to make the Breen ginormous in this season, but something about their size just cracks me up every time I see them. They almost remind me of that giant robot in the Venture Brothers episode 20 Years to Midnight. Ignore me! But what's really silly about this is that we still can't understand what they're saying. Now, that wasn't a problem in previous Breen outings because they never really tried to talk to anyone, but here they're constantly interacting verbally with other characters, and those characters can all understand them. So why can't we? What the hell is the point of even giving them dialogue if it all sounds like a broken order box to us? No, I said French fries! Hell, even subtitles would have been better than nothing. It's really hard to explain how silly it looks to have one character say something in plain English and nod while the other character responds with the garbled static of an AM radio. But the cold hard fact is that the Breens simply add nothing to the Dominion. The Dominion were already badass, and since we still never learn anything about the Breen anyway, it makes them a relatively pointless addition to what was already an interesting opposition. The only useful thing their presence does is to add yet another plot thread to the season, and this one I'm kind of on the fence about. After the Breen's induction, Damar starts to get nervous. He feels that the Dominion is casting Cardassia aside for their new allies. Eventually, this leads to his decision to form a Dominion resistance and later recruits help from Kira, Odo, and Garrick. Now, I'm of two minds on this story. On the one hand, it makes sense, which is already a hell of a lot more than I can say for the other plot threads of this season. Damar never liked the Dominion anyway, and he was only going along with the Alliance because Ducat was on board. Now that he's gone, I can see him saying fuck it and turning against them. The motivations are fine, but the thing that bothers me about this is that Damar, in and of himself, is not a very interesting character, and he's the last person I would have put in the front row of a story arc. As a supporting character, he's great, but give him a story all his own, and I really don't care that much. Also, for as much as I kind of like the interactions between Kira and Odo in this story arc, I really wish they would have left Garrick at home. I understand that they didn't have anywhere else to put him in this season, but Garrick really got old for me after a while. In the first few seasons, he was great. I'd say right up until the Romulan Cardassian fleet got their asses kicked. After that, he became far too repetitive, and over time, even a little obnoxious. In the beginning, we would get scenes of him saying to Bashir, "Why, Doctor, after all those lunches we've had together, you still don't trust me." There's hope for you yet. Now, the first time around, this kind of scene was great. However, you soon realize as the seasons go on that Garrick is going to have many more scenes, and they're all going to be exactly like that one. Now, with the exception of Section 31 infecting the Founders with a disease, which I haven't talked about because it's so boring I don't want to talk about it, This is essentially our season. We have pointless additions to the Dominion that no one wanted or asked for, and the addition of magic to this once, at the very least, plausible science fiction show. So how does it all wrap itself up? Well, the first part wraps up pretty much the way you'd expect. The Resistance eventually make it to the Dominion's central command and holds its leaders hostage. Oh, and Wayun also dies, which doesn't seem to make much sense considering they can just clone him. But you see, we were told earlier in the season that Damar's Resistance attacked an outpost that had all of Wayun's cloning facilities on it. Yeah, that makes sense. A native to the Gamma Quadrant has all of his cloning facilities in the Alpha Quadrant. Ugh. What makes this poor excuse to have a big character death worse is that Garrick, of all people, is the one who pulls the trigger. The female changeling sees Wayun dead on the floor and says, "I wish you hadn't done that. That was Wayun's last clone." To which Garrick responds, "I was hoping you'd say that," even though I never even met Wayun before today. Anyway, eventually Odo links with the female changeling, and she up and decides to make a full and unconditional surrender. I suppose we're to assume that this is because he agreed to go back home, but it kind of raises the question of why this didn't happen in the last season. Odo was seduced by his people anyway, and he and the female changeling were linking all the time. All in all, this was an okay wrap-up to the Dominion War. Not quite as satisfying as it could have been, but hey, it was an ending. Unfortunately, it was not the ending. The ending is absolutely unforgivable. If the end of the Dominion War had been the end of the whole series, it would have been pretty alright. Nothing special, but decent. You know, I might even have been able to overlook the 3-hour-long song that Vic sings over a bunch of episode clips. God, even Voyager managed not to make their last episode a clip episode. But no, the real ending is this. Sisko is contacted once again by magic and goes to the fire caves. Yes, they really are called fire caves, where Wynn and Dukat are. They have just released the magic fire monsters from the caves, which of course raises the question of how a Pa-Wraith could have invaded Sisko's mind at the beginning of this season if they hadn't been released yet. So what ultimately turns out to be the goal of the Pa-Wraiths? They are going to set the universe in flames, to burn for all eternity! Okay, and why are they going to do that? Well, I don't know. I assume they have a good reason. I never really bothered to ask, to be honest. But don't worry, I'll tell you why the Pa-Wraiths had this as their goal. Because that's bad. Setting the universe on fire. Nobody likes that. We didn't watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine for 7 seasons to see a magic fight between Sisko and Dukat. And what's worse is that this isn't even much of a fight. Dukat gets demonically possessed by the Wraiths once again, and he just freezes Sisko in his tracks and talks at him for 5 minutes. Now, once again, what was the point of the Prophets sending Sisko down here if he can't defend himself against magic? They know he doesn't have any magic powers, and we know they can just take over his body whenever they want. So why aren't they helping him out here? And who cares? Wynn dies, Dukat gets knocked into the lava pit along with Gollum, and Sisko just up and disappears. Later on, Cassidy, Sisko's new wife, gets contacted in her mind by Sisko. What? Oh, whatever. Yeah, apparently he has psychic powers now. So he tells her that he's gonna go live in the wormhole for a while. When she asks how long he's gonna be doing this, he says, I don't really know. It could be until tomorrow, or it could be 1,000 years from now, to well after you're long dead. But you can just wait for me, right? You're not doing anything with your life right now, are you? This is how you take a subpar final episode and make it the second worst series finale in Star Trek history. Yeah, you all know what the absolute worst was. Half the people end up leaving, less than half leave for a good reason. We end the show feeling very unsatisfied and frustrated. It's a good thing this series had mostly good seasons, or this might have been Wait, hang on, stop the review. What was up with that Bajoran kid that stabbed Sisko? Who was he? How did he know Cisco was on Earth and that he was looking for that orb? Did they ever get back to that? They just left it hanging in midair? The fuck? Star Trek Deep Space Nine is still one of my favorite science fiction shows, and I tend to consider the final season to be one of those rare missteps that just happens to shows sometimes. I don't know, maybe the sixth season was so good that they just didn't know where to go with it and just chucked ideas at the screen. The season is overflowing with problems, and I haven't even listed them all here. You really have to watch it yourself to see how asinine and tedious it gets. But then... no, just don't watch it. The end.